Thank you very much, Nigel. And yeah, it is incredibly busy at the moment. Interestingly, I was in Paris once a year. My agency network has a big meeting in Paris. That's where the HQ is. And over the last couple of years, the first thing my colleagues have said to me is, "What the bloody hell is going on in the UK this week or this month?" And it was refreshing to go to Paris this year and me to be able to ask my French and German colleagues what the bloody hell was going on at their end. And so I guess my first big observation is that this government is struggling a little bit at the moment, but there is a level of political stability in the UK that we have that is unusual for the UK in recent history and is actually quite unusual in Europe actually at the moment. And I think that as a starting point is very helpful because it reduces political risk in investment. And if we're talking about growth, governments often don't do lots and lots to help growth, but they can certainly get in the way of it. And I think removing politics as a barrier to growth is super important. So I'm just going to reflect on that actually, because it's very opposite. The big thing that has been going on in the business community in relation to politics, the big discussion has been, why is the government being so doomsterish and gloomsterish? It's spent a lot of the summer saying this is the worst fiscal inheritance since the war. There's no money. It's going to be cut. It's going to be tax. Things are going to get worse before they get better. But simultaneously, sending invitations out to global investors and big companies to attend their international investment summit at the end of in October. And there was something very jarring about this message that the UK is open for business. Come here, grow, employ people, but at the other end of it, saying this country's in a real bloody mess. And I think that tension has kind of got to breaking point over the last couple of weeks or so. And the government has realised that really it needs to start turning the optimism gauge up a little bit, and it is, to be fair. But I think the communications around it haven't been very deft. I think they were trying to run a George Osborne playbook, which is prepare the society for austerity and cutbacks. But this is a Labour government, and I think the brand promise of a Labour government isn't austerity, it isn't cuts. It's actually we're going to sort public services out and we're going to move forward. And actually, that was the Labour Party's election manifesto. It was a relatively optimistic prospectus. So, what did we get out of conference? Well, the business is definitely a bit grumpy with the government at the moment. There's no doubt about it. They're a bit confused. They don't really think the government is getting the message. And the membership is a bit grumpy too, because they're thinking that Labour is, well, it's a bit all over the place in relation to the free gifts, Lord Ali. So these two things are going on at the same time. But we do have a budget coming, and I think you can focus on the messaging, the narrative, and the sort of SW1 sort of gossip. I think the budget is absolutely the first crucial test of this government, because this is hard policy that makes a difference, and an awful lot is riding on it. The credibility of the government is riding on it to a certain extent. So there are certain things that we think I think people are already beginning to price in. So inheritance tax changes to make that regime less generous. Capital gains tax regime is probably going to be made less generous. The non-dom regime, which was going to be heavily restricted, apparently is now under review, because we've seen reports from particularly wealth managers that internationally mobile capital is already moving. So I think they're having second thoughts on that. But there is one absolutely massive change, which I think dwarfs everything else in this budget. And that's if Rachel Reeves decides to rewrite the fiscal rules. Because at the moment, the spending envelope, as they call it, of the government is constrained by certain rules. And what that has done is massively restrict the amount of money that the government can use to invest. And what do we know about the UK economy? It is short on investment. The capital stock of this country has been run down, and the government doesn't have the financial firepower to turn it around. if you rewrite the fiscal rules to look at the balance sheet, the government balance sheet differently, suddenly you have potentially billions and billions of pounds that could be spent on infrastructure, on green energy, on funding GB energy, on funding the National Wealth Fund. And that is what begins to unlock some of the ambitions that this government has. So I think that's the one change you need to look at very carefully, because governments will increase tax rates at the margin on certain things, and people will be upset about it. But it's not often that a government can make a single transformative move in a budget, and this is one of them. And that could also have an impact in this parliament as well. This is the other issue with long-term investment, that the effects aren't always felt within the envelope or within the timescale of one parliament. I think Labour really need to show progress on some of these issues or some of these things inside this parliament if they're going to have a decent and credible platform for the next general election. I don't want to talk about it, but it comes around quickly enough. So that's the budget. There is also another few bits and pieces that are coming that are significant to the professional services sector. We saw at conference that the government is committing to bringing forward its workers' rights reform package. That will go into Parliament in October, inside the 100 days that they committed. Key change here is on the probationary period, which will come down from 2 years to probably 6 months. That's the kind of deal that Angela Rayner and Johnny Reynolds, the business secretary, seem to have cut, that 6 months will be the maximum probation period. I think for some of us who are employers, that is a little bit of a concern, that you might want a bit longer. But the view that Labour have is that by bringing it down, it will actually make the labour market less rigid and more mobile, because people will have to make decisions earlier on in employment relationships. The other thing that I will be looking at is how the right to switch off rules are constructed, because in my business we don't really, we sleep obviously, but I would expect my team to be looking at their phones, first thing in the morning and in the evening. Sometimes crises happen, and our clients at times expect us to be responsive, so I will be looking at that. And then we've also got industrial strategy, which Richard alluded to in the warm-up to this discussion. The industrial strategies, I should say, will be coming, I think, sometime after the International Investment Summit in October. And we're also getting a reform of the apprenticeship levy as well. There's quite a lot going on. So I will leave it there for the government. Just on the Conservatives, they're going to their conference this weekend. Their leadership process is still underway. It's quite a long, drawn-out process. They've got 4 candidates left. They will whittle that down to 2. That's probably going to be Kemi Badenoch and Robert Jenrick. And that will then go to a member ballot, and the new leader of the Tory party will be announced on the 2nd of November. So from the 2nd of November, you will have a functioning opposition with a leadership. It was interesting. I was talking to a Tory MP last week, young guy, only just elected. And he said that the challenge the Conservative Party and opposition has at the moment is there just aren't that many of them. And it's hard to be an opposition when you've only got 120 odd MPs, because you need to have a shadow front bench, you need to staff select committees, you need to do legislative scrutiny. So his sense was that the party would have to really focus in on a narrower number of issues and not try and chase every issue, and focus in on what they think is important. So that's it for the UK. Just on the US, my US colleagues absolutely still will not be drawn on making any predictions about this election. Like they're allergic to it. I push them all the time, and they just say we don't know. The margins will be very fine in certain districts, and the one thing that they will say is that there's a decent chance of litigation after the election, because you could have pretty tight votes that end up in the courts deciding what happens in what then goes up to the Electoral College. That said, H Advisors is running 2 webinars. I will be running that with my colleagues in Washington DC. One in October as a preview, and one after the election result is in November. So Richard, what I'll do is I will share that webinar invitation to you, and maybe you could share that with the forum as well for anybody that wanted to join. So I will leave it there, if that's okay.